start recording, and then I can do the share screen.
Well, I can do it. I'm the co-host. Oh.
Yeah. Does that look good? Can you see it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
And you can see me or not? It doesn't matter very much.
I can see you, which is very important. Yeah. Go on then, Camilla.
Okay. Right. Can I welcome everybody to this extraordinary and sad event, which is in celebration and commemoration of our colleague David Graeber, who died early last month, on September the 2nd, and who we want to celebrate as a colleague and a comrade, a colleague of great genius and insight, with an extraordinary range of publications and works across anthropology, who always provided the most fertile, insightful, and imaginative links that in his discussions, who drew upon classical sources of anthropology to come up with quite novel and original interpretations. David spoke with RAG on 3 or 4 occasions, came to speak at RAG on a number of occasions. In many ways, he truly was the most radical anthropologist, looking for these kind of original anthropology sources to ask the very big questions about origins of inequality, big questions about human nature, big questions about origins of money, and so on. So we did invite, I should say that we did invite to come today David Wengrow, who's recently been doing a great deal of work with him. But unfortunately, David Wengrow said he had to put childcare first, and RAG absolutely respects that. Is one of the most important jobs anybody can do. So we hope that we're going to be able to continue discussions with David Wengrow in the future. Today, we have Chris Knight, Jerome Lewis, and myself going to speak for short sections, like 10 or 15 minutes each, and maybe Chris a little longer. He's made a bit of preparation for this. I hope I'm going to finish soon and hand over to Chris soon, but I just wanted to say,
that's classic Zoom. Just wanted to say.
It gets its
timing.
Yeah,
can you still hear me?
Yeah, say that.
I just wanted to say that David was a friend. Can I say?
Please, David, again.
I'm going to say. David was a friend, he was a colleague, and he was a comrade on many occasions. But no way did we agree about everything. You couldn't possibly expect that because, hey, we're anarchists. So there's going to be a little bit of discussion about some of the things that we didn't always agree on. But let me hand over to Chris now.
Okay, so I wrote an obituary soon after David's death, and I gather that David's longtime colleague, David Wengrow, liked it, and he texted me that he liked the concept of the Great Barrier Reef, which I'd used. Because when what I'd written, and David Wengrow tweeted this all over the place, it was that when I heard the news, the terrible news that David had died so unexpectedly in Venice, it did seem that a massive chunk of my familiar world's intellectual and cultural ecosystem had suddenly gone. And in some ways, it reminded me of the dread I had felt years earlier on hearing of the death of sections of Australia's Great Barrier Reef. And that analogy comes to mind simply because in just a few years, I mean, David only arrived here in 2007, he just produced so much extraordinary stuff that it became like an ecosystem. It wasn't just one David. It was so many different aspects of David's work. As everybody knows, he did his fieldwork in Madagascar and taught in the United States until Yale University decided on political grounds not to renew his contract. So he made frequent trips to London, where, of course, direct action politics quickly brought us together. And I must perhaps just say something here. Intellectually, I tend to be a Marxist. Politically, I've just always found anarchists much more fun, much more agreeable to work with. The reason being that anarchists want to do things. For anarchists, in my experience at any rate, practice is primary. And so many people who call themselves Marxists want to pick at your brains and change whatever little bits of ideology are in your head. You've got the wrong thoughts, let's change the thoughts for you. And anarchists always, in my experience, have had the view that once we're all in an action together, you don't really need to worry too much about people's thoughts. Completely new, creative thoughts will arise simply out of the sense of empowerment which those of us involved in the action experience. And I very much know that was David's view. So we were delighted when we met up, and in 2007, I invited David to write the lead article in what was actually the very first issue of our journal, the Radical Anthropology Journal, and it was titled Revolution in Reverse. And in that article, David was being reflective on this worrying, shocking in some ways, fact that only 10 years after the massive upheavals of the late 90s, when we had massive movements of workers and environmentalists coming together, obviously Seattle was a huge example, there are many others, and we came up with the slogan, "Another world is possible." And it seemed that it really did feel as if it was really, really closely within grasp. And what David was saying in this article in 2007 was that so suddenly, the very idea that another world is possible seemed sadly unrealistic. And the article was tentatively exploring alternatives to what David termed the insurrectionary model. The idea that a worldwide proletarian uprising could overthrow capitalism and establish a global cooperative social order all in one go. Suggesting something more modest, David was encouraging us to celebrate elements of communism in all our relationships, irrespective of our wider political surroundings. And I noted that his mentor and inspiration, Marshall Salins, in a touching obituary, put it well when he described David as determined, quotes, to show how ostensibly dominated peoples, by their own means, subverted the states, kings, and other coercive institutions, afflicting them to create self-governing enclaves of community. So we got together, and in 2008, during the banking crisis, David helped inspire, as he was always doing, unusually imaginative demonstrations against global governance by unelected bankers, and in April 2009, against the London G20 summit. And it was at that stage that David, working with us, was breaking off temporarily from his groundbreaking anthropological study of debt. And 2 years later, this appeared in print as the book that made his name, Debt, the First 5,000 Years. Now, I just wanted to read out a few absolute gems from this book, Debt. And I just wanted to say that it was actually I think it was in 2012, we were preparing for the great TUC March, what we call the Battle of Britain. And we built this huge, big horse. It was symbolizing the Trade Union Congress. We called it the Trade Union Congress Armed Wing, obviously with a bit of sense of fun. And David gave me a preprint copy of Debt. So let me just read out a few, what I think of absolute gems from this amazing book. And perhaps I should say, when I read it, I just thought, it's hard to find a book more powerful than Das Kapital. But I somehow agreed with a huge lot of this book as against some of Marx's ideas, for example, about what money is. And it was certainly a much more readable book than Das Kapital. I mean, how many of us have actually read all those volumes? I mean, I know people claim to have done, and I'm sure it's true, but it was just such an extraordinary journey to read that book. And it was, for me, it was an absolute inspiration. So just a few quotes, please. Solitary pleasures, David writes, will always exist. But for most human beings, the most pleasurable activities almost always involve sharing something: music, food, liquor, drugs, gossip, drama, beds. There is a certain communism of the senses at the root of most things we consider fun. And so that was a theme all throughout all of David's work, is fun. Things should be fun. And of course, I always felt that when you're with anarchists, activism is likely to be fun because you have rhythm, you have dance, you have music, you have costume. I mean, you sing, you don't just go around with boring slogans trying to instruct people what they're supposed to be thinking. So that's a wonderful idea. And of course, here he's touching on what it means to be human in terms of the senses, and therefore in terms of the sort of uniquely human apparatus, the sensual apparatus we humans have, and of course instincts that we have. So we're getting now to the fundamental issue. I mean, all of anthropology, of course, is a study of what it means to be human, and really you can't ask what does it mean to be human without discussing what is human nature. And here David's saying, I think in words absolutely clear, it's our nature to not only share, but actually enjoy sharing pretty much everything we've got. It's just no fun in being all alone. And then he has this amazing definition of communism. And again, when I first heard David speak, it was, we were occupying some universities in London at the time, it was the beginnings of the student uprising that moment. And I just remember the thrill I felt when David was explaining what communism is. And I just thought, how many people at a meeting like this would immediately broach the question of communism? I mean, most communists I know would be shy of doing that. And it was wonderful. And again, this is a quote from Det. I will define communism here as any human relationship that operates on the principles of from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. And just pointing out that really wherever we are, given the chance, that's what we humans do. We're aware of what each other needs, and to the extent of our ability, we do try to meet those needs. And so this is kind of communism in living all over the place. And another quote from the same book is, even capitalism can be seen as a system for managing communism. And I just remember the laughter that David elicited when he just said, honestly, capitalism couldn't survive a day if you weren't essentially communist, because if you only did things when we make a material gain out of it, how many factories, how many offices, how many co-ops, what would actually work if people weren't being instinctively and naturally helpful towards each other at work? So without that instinctive or natural everyday communism, capitalism itself wouldn't work. But of course, capitalism is a system, a very bad system, he points out, by the way, for sort of managing and constraining that communism that's part of all of us. And then this is another lovely quote, so true. All of us act like communists a good deal of the time. None of us acts like a communist consistently. And again, I just thought, you know, how come that it's such an obvious point that communism can't be just like a sort of static thing. Oh, we've got communism, so we can all lay back because the system is communist. I mean, any genuine communist society would have to be a mixture of things with a rhythm and a pulse. And even if we won this world revolution, it wouldn't mean we all sit back, okay, we've done that now, we can all relax. Communism would have to be a constant assertion of generosity and kindness against endless assertions of the opposite instincts, which are of course equally part of being human. We are great apes. We're closely related to chimpanzees. Libertarian communism is not something which primatologists recognize. I don't think libertarian communism is one of the principles of natural selection or of nature. So if we are sort of instinctively libertarian communists, is a rather amazing thing. But on the other hand, it's also true that you wouldn't expect a kind of static system. You'd expect something which, of course, we do find. And again, what we've been exploring and discovering in the radical anthropology group, particularly through Jerome Lewis's work among the Bidjeli forest people, but also Morna Finnegan's work, is what Morna Finnegan called communism in motion, the constant pulse or rhythm between being pretty sharing and communist, and in this particular case, almost matriarchal, or at least strong elements of matriarchy, but on a pendulum basis where these principles come and go and alternate between very different principles, because of course, you know, people like to relax, people like to be selfish, maybe under certain circumstances, and of course, the wider society would hope that the selfishness doesn't prevail, doesn't become too harmful to everyone's lives. And then finally, I want to come to a very important quote from Dett. And this, again, I initially felt very strongly I could identify with until I sort of thought about it. And then I sort of realized, this is one of the things which I think, as Camilla said earlier, those of us who are in our activism anarchists, we're not going to agree on everything. And this is a very two-edged statement from David, but I'm going to read it out. Our thinking about communism has been dominated by a myth. Once upon a time, humans held all things in common. In the Garden of Eden, during the golden age of Saturn, in Paleolithic hunter-gatherer bands. Then came the fall, as a result of which we are now cursed with divisions of power and private property. The dream was that someday we would finally be in a position to put things back, to restore common ownership and common management of collective resources. We might call this mythic communism or even epic communism, a story we like to tell ourselves. Since the days of the French Revolution, it has inspired millions, but it has also done enormous damage to humanity. It's high time, I think, to brush the entire argument aside. So many of us, of course, on the left have had this view that once upon a time we were egalitarian hunter-gatherers, and sharing was the norm, and the prevailing logic was from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. And here David is saying, and those of you who've read the book and read other stuff by David will recognize it, that hunter-gatherers aren't specially communist. There's nothing particularly communist about hunter-gatherers. You can be communist in that sense as farmers, as city dwellers, or in any other context. And of course, I can fully sympathize with the reasoning there, because another point to make is that from David's background in the States, a particularly prominent anarchist theorist, John Zerzan, was advocating and still is advocating kind of turning our backs on technology and going back to bows and arrows, really. Of course, this is primitivism. And David was absolutely withering in his criticism of the idea that we can sort of turn back the clock and go back to bows and arrows. And so, of course, it's true that if in order to get to communism, we really had to go back to being hunters and gatherers, it would be pretty tragic for all of us. And it's so important to make the point, again, which is absolutely central to everything that David was doing. There's no reason why cities should have to be dominated by alpha males, or why cities should have to be dominated by kings or rulers. So I mean, there's a big debate around that, but I'll kind of leave that there. But let me just say as well, again, I'm going to take from another wonderful book, published, of course, a lot earlier, Fragments of an Anarchist Anthropology, and perhaps just make the point that there is a sense, but David was perhaps the first to say it, certainly with any effect, there is a sense in which anthropology sort of has to be anarchist, simply because traditionally we've studied small-scale societies where kinship relationships, interpersonal relationships prevail. And without a state. And if there is a state, of course, usually as anthropologists, we don't study the state structures, we study the local small scale structures. So there's something intrinsically interpersonal and also kind of anarchist about the very subject matter of anthropology traditionally. But here, much more powerfully in some ways in Fragments, David explains his consistent focus, and this is a focus through everything he writes, including debt. So just to say briefly, in debt, what's the origin of money? Well, violence. You have some thug, some conquistador, some warlord who promises his accomplices in crime that he will share out the loot. And I'm simplifying hugely here, of course, but he gives all of his followers little IOUs with his head imprinted on it, perhaps little bits of metal, promising to pay the share of the loot. And that, in a sense, that's the origin of coinage. But the crucial point here is that, kind of unlike Marx, at least not as explicitly as I think Marx might have been, money, the origin of money and the origin of debt, because all money is kind of debt, it's a promise to pay, the origin of it all is violence. And I don't know anyone who's targeted violence with quite such a sharp spotlight as David. And this is a typical passage from Fragments, explaining why violence is his central theme. And this is a quote: because violence particularly structural violence, creates ignorance. If you have the power to hit people over the head whenever you want, you don't have to trouble yourself too much figuring out what they think is going on, and therefore, generally speaking, you don't. Hence the surefire way to simplify social arrangements, to ignore the incredibly complex play of perspectives, passions, insights, desires, and mutual understandings that human life is really made of, is to make a rule and threaten to attack anyone who breaks it. This is why violence has always been the favored recourse of the stupid. It is the one form of stupidity which it is almost impossible to come up with an intelligent response. It is also, of course, the basis of the state. And once again, I mean, who has ever put it more brutally and simply? Absolutely brilliant. And then perhaps just finally, in terms of just quotes from David, as Camilla
you want to show the screens? You haven't shown your quotes on screen.
Well, I'm going to get to the quotes on screen, but it's just what I feel, Camilla, is that if I read them up first, it may be better than having them. If I have this feeling that when people read on a screen, they sort of don't wonder why I'm reading out what's already on the screen. So just I'll get to them in a second.
Deliberate.
Yes, it is. It is.
You're going to wind up in 2 minutes, yeah?
2 minutes. Okay.
Wind up in 2 minutes.
So Camilla mentioned this one, which is again from Fragments. In many ways, anthropology seems a discipline terrified of its own potential. It is, for example, the only discipline in a position to make generalizations about humanity as a whole, since it is the only discipline that actually takes all of humanity into account. Yet it resolutely refuses to do so. And I will say this has been the position that we've had as well all along. How is it that this extraordinarily relevant, socially, politically, at every level relevant discipline is an oddie, a kind of thing which you can't even study at school, some obscure thing, rather like, you know, I don't know, collecting stamps or something. And yet, it took David to really break that asunder and make anthropology the relevant discipline that show that it's the relevant discipline that it is. And then finally, perhaps I'll put up these. Okay, now this is just. Can you see the screen, everybody? Is it sort of shut off by my face or something?
No. Yes, we can see the screen.
Just to say, I was so warmly grateful to David when I had a difficult time. It was in 2009, April the 1st, and just afterwards, I was chair of the union at my college, and I was suspended and then sacked for trying to organize the alternative London summit when the G20 was going on. And this is his words: the idea of suspending a professor. This is David writing a complaint to the UEL as part of a series of petitions. The idea of suspending a professor for saying they'd like to see a revolution is absolutely chilling. By that standard, half the people whose work we teach would not themselves qualify to teach in our schools. It's all the more ridiculous considering everyone is perfectly well aware Chris is not an advocate of violence. Shutting down the alternative summit was absolutely disgraceful. This is precisely the kind of resistance to government policies, the thoughtful discussion of alternatives that one would have thought universities were there to encourage. Does UEL, University of East London, really want to go down in history as opening a new page in the suppression of intellectual freedom and freedom of speech? Because if they continue this way, that's certainly what they will be most known for throughout the world. So, I mean, that's David's solidarity with me. I'll just leave it here. I mean, just one last thing. In the first chapter of Debt, for a very long time, the intellectual consensus has been that we can no longer ask great questions. Increasingly, it's looking like we have no other choice. Yes, just rest in power, comrades. I'll echo one of David's close friends. Just to say, by the way, this is Sophie Karapetian's eulogy for David Graeber in Mute magazine. I would recommend that as the most wonderful, moving tribute to a very close friend that's been published so far. I'd just recommend it to everybody. Okay, that's it. And now I'm going to not share the screen. I'm going to unshare the screen. What do I do to unshare the screen? Stop sharing.
Stop sharing.
Yeah, there we are. I've done it.
Right.
You need to enable me to share my screen now.
Oh, right. Okay. Now. Okay. Right. That's right. Okay. Now you can.
You need to make Jerome co-host.
I'm doing that. Yes. There
Right.
you are. Make co-host.
Right.
Over to you. Okay, Jerome or Camilla.
No, Jerome, go on.
Yeah, I'm just getting there.
Yeah.
Okay. You can see the screen, can you?
Yes.
Good.
Yep.
All right. So, I mean, perhaps it's a little bit disingenuous, the title, because of course David Wengrow and David Graeber worked very intimately on this book, which I'm very excited and looking forward to, but is not yet published. And one of the early chapters in that book, David gave as a seminar at UCL last year, and it was absolutely beautiful in the profound transformation of our, or at least my understanding of recent European intellectual history. And in particular, so sorry, I should just say firstly that the book hasn't been published. And you know what I'm going to say is taken from that talk of David's. So there are some other things I'll throw in, of course, but it is published in French on the Mouse website that Chris just briefly put up on his screen. So you can read it if you can read French. Someone's got their microphone on.
Lawrence, can you mute?
Unmute everybody.
Mute everyone.
I hope I haven't muted Jerome. Oh my God, I've muted Jerome. I'll unmute.
Okay, you can hear me again.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Good. So it's an extremely important text because it lays bare the enormous debt that European intellectual life and political evolution owes to indigenous North Americans. And for me, it was really transformational because it made clear that actually the age of reason, something which of university academics were extraordinarily grateful for, because of course you couldn't think freely in Ancien Régime France. You would be immediately, there we are, you would be immediately cut down for saying anything that would not be in accordance with either the church or the absolute monarch, at that time Louis XV. And l'état c'est moi, the state is me, was his one of his famous quotes. And this sort of absolute power that was held by the elites was something that you were just born into and you just accepted. It was so thoroughgoing that it affected every part of your life, from where you would sit at table to who you could eat with, where you could walk, what clothes you could or could not wear. The hierarchies of where you were allowed to go, what your role in life was, were so structured, were so absolute, that it was a real tyranny for the vast majority of people living in Europe at the time. And of course, the church was the sort of police and the dominant force in the intellectual life of people. And as soon as somebody would say something that was in whatever way seen as a threat to the power of the church, they were immediately called a heretic or some such term. And the penalty was death if you could not find a way of escaping from that challenge. So the situation in Europe in the 18th century was extremely dominating, extremely hierarchical, and there was no real room for critical reflection on ideas. And what this work that David and David have done is that it exposes how the catalyst for the undermining of that great sort of hierarchy and power was in fact something that came from the indigenous wisdom that the French were encountering as they invaded the eastern woodlands of what is now known as North America. So what was particularly sort of significant, I think, about this was that the extreme thuggery that had been practiced in the invasion of Latin America, South America, was something that had outraged the thinking people of Europe, and had provoked within the church as well a certain need to somehow, organize ideologically the conquest that was going on. And so, of course, there were the debates about the inherent rights of man, about the idea of the contrast between man in the state of nature and civilized man, or Christian man, as it was really thought of. And this sort of dialogue and discussion meant that when the French entered their, began their invasion of North America, it was no longer possible for the Jesuit priests and others who were going there to just simply, murder, hang, and kill off, and various other awful things that were going on in South America with native peoples. And this was linked to the idea of terra nullius, of course. So because of the declaration that any land that was not occupied by Christians could be considered terra nullius to Christians, and they could occupy it. And so a lot of work that was done in order to legitimate the invasion of Latin America was to, force on these texts, in Latin, as people were encountered by the invaders. They would read out these Latin texts, which of course nobody would understood. And then because nobody understood them, they were termed, not to be, they were heathens, and therefore they could be treated as was felt appropriate by those particular men. And the treatment was often of an appalling nature. So the Jesuit priests that accompanied the French sought to persuade people of the superiority of Christianity through dialogue. And that was extremely important, the significance that they laid on this dialogue, because being good Jesuits, they recorded the discussions that they were having with local people. And in fact, during that period, those discussions became the subject of much interest back in Europe. And altogether, 74 volumes of these discussions were published at various points during the 18th century. They led to sort of a blossoming of discussion of theatre, plays, all sorts of ideas that were not possible to present by Europeans could be presented through the voices of the indigenous peoples of North America, because it would protect the one who was promoting that voice from the savagery of the church. So what I want to do, and this is one of the things I like very much about what David and David have done in this chapter, is they give plenty of space to the voices of these indigenous people. And one of the most sort of celebrated and really quite remarkable of these people was a man called Candiaronk. And Candiaronk was really held in awe because he was so eloquent, intelligent. He was he spoke numerous languages. He was able to engage in very thoughtful and robust argument with the Jesuits and with, in fact, whoever he met. And people would often invite him to just come and be present at the events they were holding, just simply to provoke him into discussion, because his dialogue was just so beautiful and thoughtful. So I just wanted to read you perhaps some examples of that dialogue that Candiaronk in particular, who was this epitome of what the indigenous voice was able to do to the edifices constructed by these outrageous hierarchies and this domination of the church. So let me just find them. So this is a reflection on some of these early dialogues from one of the scholars. Despite the almost unanimous chorus of Western scholars insisting that the dialogues are imaginary because they were provoking so much interest in Europe, there is excellent reason for accepting them as genuine. First, those closest to the historical Kandiaronk were uniformly in awe of his oratorical skills wherever he went. His contemporaries entreated him to speak for the listeners' sheer joy in hearing him. His wit was legendary. Charlevoix described Kandiaronk as so naturally eloquent that no one perhaps ever exceeded him in mental capacity. An exceptional council speaker, he was not less brilliant in conversation in private, and councilmen and negotiators often took pleasure in provoking him to hear his repartees. Always animated, full of wit, and generally unanswerable, he was the only man in Canada who was a match for the governor, Count of Frontenac, who often invited him to his table to give his officers this pleasure. So these discussions that Kandiaronk was invited to were recorded because of the quality of what he said. And in particular, a Frenchman called La Hontan was very keen and spent a lot of time writing up these discussions in his memoirs. So this is some of the accounts that La Hontan made of his discussions with Kandiaronk. And this is first starts with La Hontan's voice. Such as have been in France were continually teasing us with the faults and disorders they observed in our towns as being occasioned by money. There's now no point in trying to remonstrate with them about how useful the distinction of property is for the support of society. They make a joke of anything you say or on that account. In short, they neither quarrel nor fight nor slander one another. They scoff at arts and sciences and laugh at the difference of ranks which is observed with us. They brand us all slaves and call us miserable souls whose life is not worth having, alleging that we degrade ourselves in subjecting ourselves to one man, the king, who possesses all the power and is bound by no law but his own. They think it unaccountable that one man should have more than another and that the rich should have more respect than the poor. In short, they say, the name of savages which we bestow upon them would fit ourselves better, since there is nothing in our actions that bears an appearance of wisdom. So on God, Kandiaronk counters. Having thought long and hard over the course of a decade about what the Jesuits have told us of the life and death of the Son of the Great Spirit, any Wendat, Kandiaronk was a Wendat, could give you 20 counter-arguments. For myself, I've always held that if it were possible that God had lowered his standards sufficiently to come down to earth, he would have done it in full view of everyone, descending in triumph with pomp and majesty, and most publicly. He would have gone from nation to nation, performing mighty miracles, thus giving everyone the same laws. Then we would all have had exactly the same religion, uniformly spread and equally known throughout the four corners of the world, proving to our descendants from then till 10,000 years into the future the truth of this religion. Instead, there are 500 or 600 religions, each distinct from the other, of which, according to you, the religion of the French alone is any good, sainted, or true. So, these kinds of counter-arguments were extremely stimulating, and there were other elements of the dialogues that were coming out from the Jesuits' attempts to convert the North American woodlanders. And these, for instance, were on the rights of women and the power that women had in society. And one of the things that was very important for this emerging literate, well, they were elite women or upper class women, but was that these dialogues provided them with a really radical alternative philosophy that was really powerful and affected many of them. But I just want to share some of Kandiaronk's reflections on law, because the idea of punitive law, where you punish people for their bad behaviors, was something that the woodlanders found really distressing. So La Hontan says, "This is why the wicked need to be punished and the good need to be rewarded. Otherwise murder, robbery and defamation would spread everywhere. And in a word, we would become the most miserable people upon the face of the earth. To which Kandiaronk replies, for my own part, I find it hard to see how you could be much more miserable than you already are. What kind of human, what species of creature must Europeans be that they have to be forced to do good and only refrain from evil because of the fear of punishment? You have observed that we lack judges. What is the reason for that? Well, we never bring suits against one another. And why do we never bring lawsuits? Well, because we made a decision neither to accept or make use of money. And why do we refuse to allow money into our communities? The reason is this: we are determined not to have laws, because since the world was a world, our ancestors have been able to live contentedly without them. And of course, you can see the deep appeal of this very anarchistic view to someone like David, and of course to many of us here. And a bit more from Kandiaronk. I have spent 6 years reflecting on the state of European society, and still I can't think of a single way they act that's not inhuman. And I genuinely think this can only be the case as long as you stick to your distinctions of mine and thine. I affirm that what you call money is the devil of devils, the tyrant of the French, the source of all evils, the bane of souls and the slaughterhouse of the living. To imagine one can live in the country of money and preserves one's soul is like imagining one could preserve one's life at the bottom of a lake. Money is the father of luxury, lasciviousness, intrigues, trickery, lies, betrayal, insincerity, and all the world's worst behaviors. Fathers sell their children, husbands their wives, wives betray their husbands, brothers kill each other, friends are false, and all because of money. In the light of all this, tell me that we Wendat are not right in refusing to touch or much as look at silver. So you can see from some of these really thoughtful reflections that these dialogues were going to be deeply powerful on the European mind. And it really is very clear that they inspired salon debates in fashionable parts of Europe that really created a whole movement of resistance against the old certainties of Renaissance Europe. And it's important to remember that, you know, the Renaissance was this idea that somehow we could rebirth true Christian living based on the Bible, of course, and church interpretation of that after the flood. And that this was the really important thing that had to happen. And that's what justified the church's domination of the intellectual life at that time. But it became completely undermined by this critique. And that undermining made it unacceptable to thoughtful Europeans that the church could continue to dictate what was all right to think and what was not all right to think. And of course, you know, the European intellectuals, they had various ways of trying to justify and further legitimate their hierarchies and their right to go and colonize places like the woodlands of North America. But the consequences were profound, and what David and David bring out of this, and I think is a very, very important point, was that was effectively the birth of the left in European politics. That it was from these critiques and the thinking that provoked among Europeans that an effective counter to the dominance of the church and the right wing, the hierarchies of the monarchies, became possible. So what's very interesting is that the main resistance to Kandiaronk's critique came from Turgot in particular, a French philosopher who realized that, you know, if we try and put morals as the legitimating feature of what allows us to go and dominate other people, it wasn't tenable. So he emphasized technology. And this led to the idea of progress, and Adam Smith and others jumped on this bandwagon. The idea that there was some sort of technological progress that could determine the hierarchies of human societies. So those very simple hunter-gatherer societies were, you know, at the lowest rung of technology. They were the lowest form of humanity. Then you had these various sort of pastoral or farming communities who are living simply on subsistence. Well, that's sort of a bit more advanced, and then you get these very sophisticated feudal states, and that really is the you know, the pinnacle of social organization and the idea of empire, and that you know, that you could conduct, the emperor was conducting this beautiful symphony of different parts all working together to create the greatness of the nation. That was in fact what we inherited as the response, and has been, of course, for the past you know, few hundred years, the dominant way that we've understood what's going on in the world in terms of progress and development. And the spread of colonialism was justified on that basis, the paternalism that came into later colonialism. But of course, you know, this is just racism in a new guise, because it conveniently places Western technological supremacy at the pinnacle of human achievement, as opposed to the moral life and the quality of life of the people inhabiting such societies. Sorry, I should give you another screen. So this was just an example of one of Kandiahonk's famous speeches. But what this really does emphasize is the huge significance in our times. Sorry, maybe I should go back, but I don't think I can. Of trying to really challenge dominant ideologies in the West through listening to the voices of those on the margins of the West. And this is something that, for instance, well, that David and David are doing beautifully in this book as they explore the archaeological past, the various strains of resistance to the dominant ideologies of Western late capitalism. But it's not just them, of course. And Arturo Escobar is perhaps one of the more popular North American, he's Colombian actually by origin, but he works in North America, who's really been emphasizing this, that this one worldism, this dominance of this idea of progress, of development, is a profound structural violence on the rest of the world. And of course, with the ecological environmental crisis we're currently experiencing, of which COVID is just an epiphenomenon, and you know, we will see much more dramatic events if we don't sort things out rapidly, is imposing on the rest of the world, and something which really we need to really work hard to resist. And in particular, the idea of growth, which is linked to the idea of progress, of course, and development, is enshrined in this notion of modernity, this idea that Latour so beautifully deconstructs, that, you know, it's always out of our reach, because modernity is always something that's happening next. And whatever we manage to achieve will not be modernity. So modernity is this constant striving for something that you will never arrive at. And those things work beautifully for capitalism, of course, because you'll be constantly needing to buy new stuff in order to become modern, or enact new ways of organizing yourself bureaucratically and so on. But actually, the real challenge is not to be modern. The real challenge, as Latour quite rightly points out, is to be contemporary. And in this time of extreme crisis, I think that that is the great message that David's life leaves us, is the importance of being contemporary, of being fearless to challenge the accepted mores and ideologies that dominate and have catapulted the whole of humanity. In fact, not just humanity, but the myriad other species that we share this beautiful planet with, into this extreme crisis. And David, of course, in his life, really exemplified the importance of being contemporary, of being a man of your moment, of fearlessly looking at what is going on and challenging it, not accepting it. And for that, of course, his death is an enormous loss. But I think his example is something that we all need to take forward and hold strongly in our hearts as we face what is going to be an extremely difficult decade. And I just wanted to say that we're doing that in the Flourishing Diversity at UCL, where we invited all Indigenous people from all over the world to come and join us and share their reflections, to bring Kandiahoink, in a sense, to London, to really help us understand these things. And what was fascinating was how for them it was a holistic engagement with us. So often they would begin their talks with a musical song, a particular chant, or something which for them embodied the essence of what they were trying to say. And then they would say it and hope that we understood. And it really was quite remarkable, the enthusiasm and passion that they managed to ignite in these very staid lecture theatres of UCL. It's obviously a continuing dialogue. But in these times of trouble, we really do need to pay very strong attention to these Indigenous voices again, because they are really offering us the most coherent understandings and ways forward to correct our savagery in destroying so much of this beautiful planet. And I do hope that we continue to be able to do that going forward. So that's me. I hope it wasn't too long.
Thanks, Jerome. That was lovely to hear. Oh no, I can't get on. Oh no. Damn it. Just lost it. Can you hear me?
I can hear very well. Yeah. What's happened?
You've lost me vision, or I've lost me anyway. Oh no. Got me back again. Can you see me?
Yes, there we are.
Yeah, sorry. I'm just going all over the place. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, I'll try and run this quite quickly and talk about a little bit at first about David as an activist, because he was like always there. I can remember the occasions bumping into David in the steaming ruins of Millbank after the students had sacked it. I can remember bumping into him on the bridges being occupied by Extinction Rebellion, Occupy, on roadblocks going to power stations early one winter's morning. He was like, every time he was going to be there. And of course, the question of UEL's occupation when that was happening, again, in response to Gaza, of course. And then David's excellent role in standing up against the horrendous propaganda against Jeremy Corbyn in the general election just last winter, and his role in that. And he was always there. And I don't think there was very much ever political difference with David. What I remember from his work, his academic work that was so beautiful, was his celebration of the carnival puppets. And we were involved in, Chris has mentioned the Trojan horses, the Trojan horse we created for the Battle of Britain in the TUC March in April 2012. But David especially made these beautiful analyses of how the creation of puppets was a kind of culture's creative refusal. It was the demonstration of what it was to be human, to be non-violent. Everything, all those quotes that Chris was pulling out of Debt in terms of our communistic nature, our wish to be creative, our wish to give each other pleasure. That was really the puppets, the beautiful creations. When we're talking about puppets, we mean these massive, great giant horsemen and so forth. And he used to make these beautiful structural games of opposition with the brutish police force, right up against, particularly the photographs of the police, right up against puppets of pigs, for instance, as a really sort of sharp way of demonstrating the opposition that was entailed. Okay, there was one time David wasn't there where I really hoped he was going to be. And I'm going to show you something which I hope people can see. Let me adjust where my screen is. And I don't know how many people, can people see that?
Yes.
Okay, does anyone know what this is? It comes from Rojava. It comes from Jinhua, the women's village. It's made of hamala seats, which are very ancient tradition. It was made by the children of Jinhua. Jinhua is the women's village where women and children live and organize themselves autonomously in Rojava, in the autonomous administration of northeast Syria. And of course, recently, well, David was an enormous supporter of Rojava. I had the fortune to go to visit Jinhua and Rojava last year, and I really, really hoped David was going to come along on that trip, that we would have chances of good discussion. And there was a need for it because we had fallen out quite significantly. We had really come to a misunderstanding about the questions of how to approach what it is to be human. And I wanted just to have a little chance to say something about that. I've always really loved an aspect of David's work that he showed how anarchist process and anthropology are kind of they're part and parcel of each other, if you like, in fragments of anarchist anthropology, and then also in an ethnography that people don't often read, the ethnography of direct action. He was showing how in doing anthropology fieldwork, your purpose is really to hear as many, we've just been listening to Jerome, hearing the voice of Kandiaronk. You want to hear as many voices as possible and make sure that people from the community, all of them are satisfied they have given their voice. And in a anarchist horizontal consensus organizing, people intending to do direct action, intending to put their bodies on the line and doing something. Chris was talking about how anarchists have this tremendous attitude that whatever the theory, the practice counts. And in trying to work out what is the direct action that we can take together, anarchists are always trying to hear everybody's voices. If you're going to put your bodies on the line in some way that is at risk from forces of the state, you need to really discuss that. You need to really work through that and find the bottom of that. So there is a sort of intrinsic linkage between anarchy and anthropology that I always, love to hear the way David discussed that and brought that out. In Debt, especially, Chris has read some of those quotes, how communism is really human nature. Well, we could say anarcho-communism. Hunter-gatherers are very anarcho-communist. Everybody maintains their autonomy, but everybody is sharing, and there's no tolerance for somebody being higher ranked than anybody else. But that idea that capitalism parasitizes our essentially communistic nature, I think that was a very powerful idea. I remember hearing David talk about it in one of the meetings called by the student movement during like 2010, 2011, the fees movement. And so this, he was just his politics and his academic work were just so intrinsically closely linked together. Now, where did we have disagreements was in approaches to what it is to be too human in terms of, well, evolution. And David Graeber belonged to the tribe of United States cultural anthropologists, among whom Marshall Salins, for instance, has become his co-author, but was one of his supervisors at one stage, one of his mentors, definitely at one stage. And that tribe, US cultural anthropologists, has a kind of knee-jerk antagonism to any discussion of evolution in regard to human behavior. It's just like almost an anathema, which makes it very difficult to try to discuss, well, where does this human nature come from? How is it that we have communistic instincts and that we want to share everything with each other, and most especially, for instance, that we have what are universally known as cooperative eyes, our eyes of all the primate species are completely different from the eyes of all other primate species, and indeed all other closely related mammals, because we have these long, slender eyes with the white sclera background. We'll hear more about these eyes next week from Brian Hare in these talks. And many times I looked at David in the eye and said, look, these eyes of ours that that was done by evolution. It's like a hallmark in our bodies of egalitarianism. That means that we spent hundreds of thousands of years in an increasing development of egalitarianism. Now, of course, we've heard about this great project of David Wengrow and David Graeber. They had an article published a few years ago that we were very interested in. Their article really focused on the Upper Paleolithic of Europe, which tried to make the arguments that hunter-gatherer civilizations, including the Paleolithic, were no less complicated politically than any farming civilization, that they're all quite equally capable of having hierarchy or having egalitarianism. And they drew on classical anthropology sources, such as Marcel Mauss, Hubert Mauss, the seasonal variations in the life of the Eskimo. And they drew on, David Wengrow being an archaeologist, drew on Upper Paleolithic burial sources and examples to make the argument that what the Upper Paleolithic may be representing, or these apparently very wealthy, apparently high rank burials might actually be representing, was some sort of sway between hierarchy being celebrated and then kind of torn down to restore egalitarianism. And that there would be a very complex movement between the seasons, because we're talking about the Upper Paleolithic Eurasia, especially, where northerly latitudes, modern humans who'd come out of Africa would have been encountering these very seasonal environments for some of the, the first few millennia that they ever had. So we thought that this was a very interesting argument. And we respected the fact that they came to RAG and talked about it, and we respected the fact that we're not talking about human origins, they say. We're talking about the Upper Paleolithic of Europe. Okay, that's not human origins, or the origins of symbolic humans, because of course we have a long history before ever the Upper Paleolithic arrives of becoming symbolic, language-speaking modern humans in Africa. Much longer in Africa than anywhere else on Earth. So that was fine. But now we're coming with this possibility that we have the book called The Dawn of Everything. We have a number of publications by them that seem to be arguing that in human origins, actually, we weren't necessarily egalitarian at all, that hunter-gatherers themselves aren't always egalitarian. Well, that's true, because there are many different kinds of hunter-gatherers. But what seemed to me to be very important is that they were leaving aside the account of, well, what was happening in Africa. If they were considering the question of inequality arising in Europe, they were leaving aside the account of Africa. They were leaving aside any account from an evolutionary perspective at all. How could we come, where did egalitarianism come from, if there was egalitarianism or not? Why can't we understand that? And they were leaving aside the questions of sex and gender, which seemed to me, if you're asking questions about inequality, well, that must be a key aspect of the questions that you're asking. I'm really hoping that The Dawn of Everything is going to answer a lot of those questions for me, because we never satisfactorily resolved the discussion. As I say, David didn't come on that trip to Rocheville, when I think we would have had a lot of chances to really talk it through. And of course, David has become very influenced by what's happening in Rojava, in case there are people here who don't know, in terms of women's power, women's organization, in a way that is quite astonishing in that region of the world, that part of the Middle East, that women are just kind of taking a political lead, even in the most dire of circumstances where Rojava is under attack by both Assad Syria and by Turkey and many forces. Let's just finish with the whole question of matriarchy, perhaps, because David Graeber and David Wengrow now are, recently we heard David Wengrow speaking on Novara Media, reading a section of their new book, talking about the idea of matriarchy as a great taboo. And they're talking from their own institutions as professors in LSE, as professors in the Institute of Archaeology. These are very patriarchal and colonialist institutions. And they are therefore, they're from that position making an argument that, well, what about considering matriarchy? Matriarchy has been this huge taboo in discussions of, whereas in the 19th century, it used to be kind of a commonly accepted. And think of Lewis Henry Morgan's work with the Seneca, the Iroquois, Frederick Engels, James Fraser, Emile Durkheim, all of them really essentially arguing for sort of matriarchal origins, based in sometimes the work of Bachofen. But to this century, it has become this huge taboo, or this is what David Wengrow was reading about and discussing. But what I'm hoping is that in their discussion of this taboo, this idea that matriarchy is kind of the cradle of civilization, they will be acknowledging the many matriarchal women scholars. We could think of Maria Gumbutas, we could think of the great German scholar Heide Göttner-Abendroth, we could think of more recently Max Dashu, the feminist activists who were certainly not welcome in academe, like Merlin Stone and Monica Shaw, and many others. And there's also the work of Radical Anthropology Group. There's also the work by Chris Knight over 6 decades, considering the matter of did matriarchy ever exist. So I'm really hoping that they're going to give due recognition to these people who've been working away in the margins and have frequently been attacked and been trashed by a very patriarchal inclined archaeology, to recognize and give credit to those workers when they're discussing this subject of matriarchy. But just the last point to come back on evolution, and the sadness in many ways that we couldn't make that link, partly because of this kind of resistance from US cultural anthropology. It's through the understanding of evolution, I believe, that we can really understand women as the revolutionary sex. I gave a talk on that 2 weeks ago. Without having a grasp on evolution, it's very difficult to understand, how does matriarchy ever get there? Where does it come from? What matriarchy doesn't mean the same thing as patriarchy in terms of females dominating males. Matriarchy is quite different thing in terms of cooperative childcare, this movement, communism in motion that Morna Finnegan talks about, it is the cradle for our communistic instincts. But where does that come from? How do we understand it if we don't understand, have an understanding of evolution? And that is really just that is really my appeal to those who are going to be reading this work by David Graeber and David Wengrow, to keep all those questions in mind. And I really hope that there's going to be many more occasions for debate on these critical issues. I think that's enough for now. Can we now open up for questions or from the floor, because people have been listening a lot to us going on, but there'll be others here with other ideas and thoughts about Matthew Doyle's put his hand up. Can we unmute Matthew?
Hi there, can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, great. I just had a question for Chris, because it was picking up on what you were saying about how sort of David was somebody who's an academic anthropologist, but he was also able to be very creative and to use anthropological analysis to address all sorts of important social issues and sort of very big questions. And he had this very broad understanding of anthropology, and was able to be a public intellectual and an activist as well as an academic. And that's quite unusual in academic anthropology, at least in the UK. And sort of Chris made this point that academic anthropology is sort of, it's such a kind of obscure niche subject, despite the fact that it has this tremendous potential to be a sort of, you know, public presence, to answer all these important questions, these kind of issues about, like, you know, you mentioned the origins of inequality, the nature of human social life, the potential for change in society, and so on. So my question to Chris and also to Jerome and Camilla is, why do you think it is that academic anthropology is so not just politically conservative, but also intellectually conservative? And what can we learn from the example of David Graeber, specifically in terms of being academic anthropologists?
Chris, do you want to go with that?
You've got to unmute yourself, Chris.
Yeah, Chris. Chris, ask to unmute. Come on.
Slightly unmute. There you are.
Yep.
Right. Okay. Am I all right now?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. The British education system, like any education system in the West, is an initiation procedure. The whole point of school is to initiate young people into this particular way of being human, or perhaps not very human. And it was absolutely clear that if children of 15, 16, 17 were allowed to be aware of all the different ways there are across the planet, all the different ways there are of respecting the sacred, of bringing up children, of sharing, you know, the dwellings, of sharing, of having sexual relationships, all these different ways, and living without money, of course. I mean, the whole system would collapse. I mean, I would say the answer to the question is, first of all, it's why is anthropology so brutally controlled, so hived off, is because it's the most dangerous of disciplines, really, because it's not a discipline. It's the crossroads of all the different disciplines. It's where the natural sciences connect up with the human sciences. You can't study, you're allowed to study, I don't know, psychology, but as long as you're kept in sort of Western psychological frameworks. But anthropology says, if you want to study history, study the world. If you want to study psychology, study all the different ways there are of being cognitively human. It's a hugely subversive subject, and therefore in the sort of price paid by anthropology to be even allowed to be an academic discipline is, right, make sure that it's completely meaningless, it's cut off, it's talks gobbledygook, it's not taught to children at school, and when it is taught at university, it's cut up into all kinds of little fragments so that none of it makes the slightest bit of sense. And you've got a huge barbed wire fence between biological anthropology and social anthropology, a huge barbed wire fence between the study of what it means to be human today and archaeology. And so all of these things are there for a reason. Now, David's kind of smashed through all that. There's no question about it. And it's the most courageous thing to do. In RAG, we've been trying to do that, but actually with a lot less success than David. And the answer to the question, should we follow David's example? Absolutely, we should. But of course, I mean, I could go on a little bit more. I mean, clearly, anthropology started as colonialism. And Jerome touched on this, I think, a little bit. It's like the whole point of anthropology initially, of course, was to, well, first of all, to control the savages and make sure they could be exploited properly. And then following the colonial revolution and the World War II in particular, it was to help these people to develop. a development, meaning, of course, to people who live perfectly well in many parts of the world before this so-called development, meaning introducing starvation, poverty, money, inequality for the first time, and having people living on rubbish heaps outside, the big cities. So, I mean, anthropology had a very difficult history, but it is the science of what it means to be human. It is the place where everything connects up, and let's celebrate that, because there's no question about it. David is the genius who, more than any of us, managed to open the door.
Yeah, and I mean, I think perhaps we should also defend anthropology, because anthropology has been crucial in shaping many of the intellectual debates, precisely for the type of Kanjiya-Ronk influences that I was describing, that David and David have so beautifully brought out. I mean, the whole critique of development, for instance, which, as Chris just mentioned, is one of those ideologies that's so profound and of such a provoker of structural violence around the world. It's really from those grounded ethnographic studies of its impacts on real people living in real places in other parts of the world that the critique has grown and grown to the point where we are now, at quite high levels, questioning the very relevance of the notion in today's world. So we've got movements like the degrowth movement, for instance, which are really arguing the opposites, and these come from anthropology. They I mean, within our own, we're not our own, I should be careful. It's the European intellectual tradition, essentially, or Euro-American. It depends how you want to talk it, but. Within that tradition, anthropology has been the source of some of the most trenchant critiques, and continues to be today, I think, and that's very important. But one of the issues, I think, that has led to it not being as effective as it should have been, and I think that's the point of your question, perhaps, is this aping of science that was for so long part of the way that anthropology thought it needed to obtain recognition. And that has resulted in this sort of cutting up of everything, this disjointed way of organizing our studies, so that, you look at political anthropology, or you look at archaeology, or you look at evolutionary elements of teeth, or whatever it might be. And this cutting up is, on the one hand, been very effective in natural sciences, because you can burrow down, but in the context of human life and our engagement with so many different species, with each other at so many levels, with this extraordinary phenomena that we have in such abundance we call culture, I think anthropology really should have done more, and we still have a huge amount to do if we're to be contemporary to this moment, to really stimulate the sorts of changes required within the Euro-American dominant. Well, I mean, it's slipping from dominance as we speak, thankfully, but actually may be replaced with even more totalitarian aversion. So anyway, these battles, these ideological intellectual battles, are ongoing, and the urgency of people within disciplines like anthropology is absolutely crucial if we're to come to any sort of realistic and effective way of addressing them and combating their noxious influence on human beings and our companion species.
Yeah, just to, is my video on? Yeah. Just to put in a quick point about how important, most simply, communication is, and how David's free, easy, open, imaginative writing is gripping, because so many anthropologists have written themselves almost out of existence with the contortions of jargon and hermeneutics that become almost impossible to understand for anyone who isn't within the citadel of that, elite ivory tower, already signed up and joined up as an anthropologist. But just think of it, one of the very last pieces that David actually wrote, I think, I may be wrong, but one of the last he wrote a double-page spread in the big issue on the one that was curated by, edited by Jarvis Cocker, on the bullshit jobs, the idea of bullshit jobs, which also, of course, at the time of COVID and at the time had become a very hot topic. It's just this facility of communication and of kind of just tearing down the barriers of jargon, hermeneutics, and these elitist and exclusive types of writing. I think that's vitally important, and he served anthropology well in doing that.
He was just about to write a book about the Second World War, I'm told. David's next huge project was a history of the Second World War. Can you believe it? Talk about ambition.
My God.
There's a certain fearlessness there which has to be respected.
Yeah, it's just bold, leaping imagination.
Yeah.
I would have.
Do we have any questions? Sorry.
Is that Mark?
Yes.
Yeah.
Where are you, Mark?
Yes.
There you are.
Camilla mentioned Rojava, what's happening in northern Syria, and of course that was the issue over which me and David fell out. I hadn't spoken to him for several years. We've been quite, well, relatively friendly before that. And I've been sort of, since he so tragically passed away, I've been trying to work out what the real difference is. But I mean, the differences amongst, I don't know, people who read too much or left-wing activists are really important. I mean, that's where the ideas come from, in my opinion. It's not really necessarily from all the agreements, you know, having the right line on things. It's all the arguments and disagreements where we're going to progress. So I don't think that's disagreement was a bad thing, but it was very striking over Rojava, because I mean, he would look at what happened in that area of northern Syria, and he would say this was a successful or potentially successful anti-capitalist revolution. I rather pedantically would look at the amount of properties that have been taken over, or land that have been taken over by workers or peasants or whatever, and what the regime said about property, which, you know, they said it was sacred and they didn't alter property relations. And as far as I can see, it's still a completely capitalist society. So we would look at the same thing in such completely different ways. You know, he would look at the levels of democracy at a local level, which clearly occur in Rojava, and I would point out many commentators said that actually the PKK, this Kurdish Workers' Party, really pulled all the strings and controlled everything. And on the issue, perhaps the even more controversial issue of the feminist revolution in Nicaragua, he and others would say that there was such thing, not in Nicaragua, in Rojava. Rojava, yeah. So I'm going to make a comparison with Nicaragua, because of course in Nicaragua and in many other guerrilla movements in the 70s and 80s, a huge proportion of the guerrillas were young women. You know, in Nicaragua, I think the Sandinistas is about a third. And what you saw again and again is, once the war was over, even if there was a successful, supposedly, revolution, women went back into the families and nothing was changed, in my opinion, because militarizing young people, women or men, isn't itself revolutionary. It might be necessary, but it's not revolutionary. I'm trying to work out why it is that me and David, who in many respects had very similar politics, just looked at exactly the same situation and looked at it from completely different perspectives. And I guess fundamentally, it's because he had more of an anarchist perspective. I had more of a Marxist perspective. He fundamentally thought that in almost any society, humans can choose between more collective or free ways of living, or more oppressive ways of living. And it's almost, he suggests that in several of his anthropological writings. He's done something recently, or I think it's going to be in the new book. He talks about Northwest American Native Americans, where there were some communities which had slavery, and there were other communities which didn't. And I think that the argument he's going to make in his new book is that in almost every period of history, societies can flip from one to, they can choose from one to the other. Now that is inconsistent with, if you like, a Marxist perspective, which says there are particular social conditions, certainly of abundance and other factors, which make communist or egalitarian societies much more likely, and other situations such as total impoverishment or isolation, such as say in Rojava at the height of a civil war, where it makes that kind of egalitarian, properly communist society just impossible. And so I think actually the fundamental difference anthropologically and politically, the arguments around David's work, it is fundamentally different between an anarchist and, if you like, a Marxist position. And the point isn't that us Marxists are right and he's wrong, although actually I probably do believe that. But actually it is the debate between the two. That's what makes his passing so tragic, because we did need to continue those debates, and hopefully in the writings, not just this book, but other writings that hopefully will eventually appear. I presume he did other writing that might possibly be published in the future. In a strange and rather sad way, this debate can continue.
Thanks, Mark. Have we got anybody wanting to respond to that or come in on something else? Any more hands up?
Knowing something about Rojava, do you want to respond briefly, Camilla?
My knowledge of Rojava is really consists of like one visit plus participation in genealogy conferences. So I am not an expert, and I have no Middle Eastern languages, and but I think Mark may be, I think I would veer towards support for David's position of the practical, astonishing achievements in Rojava and the inspiration that Rojava has offered. We should say Rojava, even though that is a Kurdish name that means the west of Kurdistan, the actual autonomous administration, Northeast Syria, involves many different communities, not just Kurdish, including Arabic, Armenian, Assyrian, Yazidi, and there was so far as I could see, there was extraordinary evidence of interethnic dialogue and what they call transnational government, and the achievements in respect of women are not just about putting AK-47s into women's hands, especially genealogy. The science of women, or the study of women's perspectives, or whatever you might, is kind of it isn't classic Marxist, that's for sure. It has its origins in Murray Bookchin's social ecology, but genealogy brings to the social ecology a specifically female women's perspective. But when they're talking about women's perspective, they mean a very collectivist perspective. They're not thinking of feminism in a Western sense of women busting glass ceilings. They're talking about women sharing a very collective life. And I had the chance to hear discussions about that at Genoa and in genealogy research centers that were really remarkable and extraordinary discussions. And there does seem to be extraordinary, I mean, think of the degree of pay. These were the women who've been fighting ISIS. It is literally a sort of a female collective against an ultimate and extreme version of patriarchy. And they have made many extraordinary achievements. I would say, I would veer on David's side too, the practical anarchist support of that compared to, but I would understand Marx's critique as well. So I'm going to sit on the fence a little bit there.
Right.
Anybody else might like to contribute around there? Somebody is mentioning Debbie Bookchin on a Zoom talk. Is that a Zoom talk, or there'll be YouTube? There'll be many Zooms for Debbie Bookchin, I'm sure. Yeah. Anyone else?
I'm wondering what people made of Camilla's point, which about and I think Jerome touched on it as well. There's this huge division in anthropology between the biological side and the social and cultural, and the fact that, as Camilla explained it, there's the cultural anthropology tribe in the States has always sat on one side of that fence, on the cultural side, really quite hostile to any kind of Darwinism or genetics or evolutionary biology. And I think Camilla's point is that really for women everywhere, in any society, issues of childbirth, pregnancy, and all those, there's that biological constants, pretty much constants, that you can't really deal with gender or sex. And obviously there's a certain link between the two, without a real understanding. You can't deal intellectually with those issues without some understanding of evolutionary biology. I'm just wondering, I mean, that's how controversial is that to this group? I can see Daw Shilton.
Daw, can we unmute Daw?
Yes, there we are, yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you. Yes, I was just about to ask you a question about this mythic communism that David Graeber writes about. I mean, you certainly had your studies with the Hadza. Jerome Lewis studied the Invangeli, and I think these studies sort of support the idea of an original egalitarian social structure, if you call it that. But I wonder if you really hold that position. How do you see your studies like affecting this idea of mythic communism? Because I have to say, I also feel slightly on the fence about that, because although I am, very much aware of all sorts of things in human biology that certainly point towards extensive cooperation in human evolution, extending to about 2 million years. I mean, if you look at stone tool technologies, if you look at alloparenting, if you look at the hunting of large mammals, which demands some kind of cooperation, there is certainly a lot of evidence of extensive cooperation between humans. But what does that actually tell us about social organization? I mean, couldn't you have examples of extensive cooperation amongst humans while still there is coercion in that society, dominance hierarchies and things like that? I'm still not too sure about that. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, maybe I can respond to that. Thanks for that question, Daw. So, I mean, of course, human beings are intelligent, sophisticated creatures. And, since, well, I would suggest, probably around 1.5 million years, but that's a guesstimate. They have been playing around with all sorts of alternative ways of organizing themselves. And we are, unfortunately, at the tail end of some of those more egalitarian experiments, and dominated by mostly hierarchically organized societies in today's world. But I think that it is very clear to me that the type of typology that James Woodburn, for instance, developed, this immediate and delayed return system, does have enduring value for trying to understand that deep history of humanity. And I mean, the most pertinent reason that I think that is the extraordinary similarity between those radically egalitarian hunter-gatherer groups, these immediate return groups that exist around the world today. And today we only really have examples of them living in, or clear examples of them, living in Southeast Asia, South Asia, and Africa, or Sub-Saharan Africa to be more precise. So what is, that's a very wide distribution. It's not universal, but we can talk about those other regions if you are interested as to why they don't have these egalitarian groups represented. But essentially what that suggests is that there was at least some groups of hominins who left, Homo sapiens who left Africa, who were egalitarian and radically egalitarian, and that the social structures that they left Africa with were so robust that they have continued to persist up until today. And one of the things that strikes me when we look at societies with inequality is that we effectively get into those sorts of contexts that Marx identified as class struggle, that you have dominators on top who are manipulating and managing systems to their benefit, and then people underneath receiving this manipulation who are resentful and will try various means to undermine that. And that is a hugely creative process because, of course, both are scheming and trying in their various ways to escape from the clutches of the other. And we call that change, we being people living in these hierarchical societies. Because, of course, that friction is extremely productive of new forms and conflict. And so wherever you have societies based on inequality, you will have that kind of rapid change. You will have that degree of instability that we think of as normal because we're part of those societies. By contrast, what you have among these very egalitarian hunter-gatherers is an extraordinary stability, not because of primitiveness, And I think this returns to the earlier question about why biological and social anthropology in the States are so, or why social anthropology, cultural anthropologists in the States are so unwilling to engage with biological anthropologists, because somehow they have absorbed this idea of social evolution, which of course Darwin never promoted. And quite the contrary, was even reluctant to publish because he feared that people would take that view. And people have, of course, and you know, National Socialism being one of the most abhorrent examples of it. But this basic idea that, you know, because society changes when you have inequality, and it changes a lot, that means that societies that are able to achieve that level of egalitarianism and the stability that comes with that are somehow backward or primitive is entirely false. And you know, when you listen to people like Kandiaronk, you realize that the true savages are the people living like us as opposed to the people living like them. And the whole notion of social evolution is a travesty. And you know, the state that we have brought the world to is, I think, absolute evidence of the arrogance of our assumptions that somehow Western social organizations, systems, state structures are the way forward, are the you know, the highest achievement of humanity. They've produced extraordinary technical things, but that's not the measure of effective adaptations. That's just an epiphenomenon of the particular inequalities and hierarchies that these pyramidical structures enable, where you have elites who are able to enjoy the activities of the majority. So what we'd really have in these societies is very clear examples of extremely resilient, extremely robust systems that have endured, at least in the case that I've been studying, I would quite confidently say for at least 30,000 years. And the evidence suggests that possibly longer, up to 50,000 years. And that, and actually the evidence could suggest it's 75 to 100,000 years if you are willing to accept my understanding of music. And the reason I say that is because, you know, in 2010, I played a recording made in 1958 by Colin Turnbull among the Mbuti in the Ituri forest to my Bayaka friends in Congo, Brazzaville, some 1,000 miles away from them. And as soon as they heard the music, within literally 3 seconds, they said, "Oh, they're Bayaka, just like us." And at the time, you know, I was astonished and impressed, but I hadn't really understood the implications. And it wasn't until the genetic studies that identified the amount of time that those two groups have not been in contact that the full implications started to dawn on me. And what the genetic studies show is that the Bayaka and the Mbuti have not shared a mother for 27,000 years. Their material culture is almost identical in all the main elements of it. Their religious structures and systems have many remarkable similarities. Their languages are entirely different. I mean, you know, as different as language families can be. In the Ife, for instance, speak a Sudanic language, they're neighbors of the Mbuti, and the Bambenjere speak a Bantu language. And these are radically different language styles, yet they sing in exactly the same style. And it's a very distinctive, dense, hocketed polyphony style. And this style of singing is also the same sort of style used by the San Bushmen right across the San region. So and there's a couple of people, particularly a guy called Victor Grauer, who argue that this is evidence of a very ancient and stable civilization, which was the civilization of the sort of the proto-San Pygmy peoples, who are at the base of the human phylogenetic tree. So I think there is very strong evidence to suggest that these egalitarian, radically egalitarian societies of hunter-gatherers are extraordinarily resilient. The fact that they have continued to persist over such great amounts of time attests to that resilience and that stability, but not in the terms of being primitive and unchanging, but because these are optimum adaptations to being human on this planet. And that is why they have lasted so long. And we would do well to start to understand that. But it requires us to step back from the arrogance that technological progress provides us with, the way that it allows violence to become so powerful. I mean, there is no question we can destroy the planet some 30 odd times with the various nuclear weapons that are loitering around in arsenals of the world, which is of course ridiculous. We can only destroy it once. And so it seems to me that it really is of paramount importance now for us, being people living in delayed return societies, to accept that actually our notions of social progress, our notions of development, our notions of technological achievement are blinding us to the fundamental suicidal simplicity of stupidity, sorry, of our society and the values that we hold dear.
Thanks, Jerome, for that passionate defense of immediate return societies and their time scale. Can I just say a little bit to do in terms, just short to, in terms of evolution, because I don't have any doubt evolution would have produced a variety of populations of hominins with all kinds of different social formations, including, you know, paranthropines and australopithecines and early Homo and so forth. But there are certain markers of our, you know, of our bodies, biological markers, and of our capacity of language, and above all of our extraordinarily large brains, that are really indicative that even if there were populations that had, you know, considerable dominance hierarchy and sexual conflict with males prevailing, those aren't our ancestors. Our ancestors are the ones that secured more and more egalitarian tendency, and which solved sexual conflict with much more bias towards energy for mothers and their offspring. And that is really what the immediate return, big game African hunter-gatherers have done in terms of creating these cooperative childcare camps, effectively. We'll have an argument next week with Brian Hare about the cooperative eyes, but I would put that back to early Erectus, the cooperative eyes, with alongside Sarah Hurdy's narrative about the onset of intersubjectivity. But when it comes to speaking language, and when it comes to the very large brain sizes, and the logic of very large brain sizes is that females need increasing effort from males to support the energy support of their offspring. And basically females need at least one male each, as far as that goes. To have any dominant male monopolizing a number of females is not going to provide the energy that is required by females for those very large brained offspring. It's kind of an inevitable logic leading to reproductive egalitarianism. Language itself, and David expressed this most beautifully, language can only flourish in a kind of domain of communism. We use language when we're in egalitarian circumstances. As soon as somebody has the dominance or is able to prevail with violence, language really breaks down. So our very language capacity is indicative of a profound phase of egalitarianism, of egalitarian evolution, ultimately leading to the human revolution, I would argue. Anyway.
In the light of the question and Jerome's response, can I make a plea to distinguish between two concepts? One's social evolution and one's social Darwinism. Please, I don't think we should conflate those. Darwin is not a social Darwinian, but I mean, the idea that animals, you know, have not just bodies and anatomies, but they have social strategies is obviously true. And a wonderful book was written by a kind of anarchist called Social Evolution, and he was actually one of the founders of modern Darwinism, and I just say that social evolution is, there's no question that, you know, that's the idea that evolution isn't social, or that animals, you know, I just say we need to make a distinction there. Social Darwinism led to, but the Nazis invoked social Darwinism. The science of social evolution is a completely different thing. It's not about stages of development of human societies and stuff. It's just about all animals are social.
Yeah,
different ways.
Sad that Robert Trivers has his book called Social Evolution, and it's the most amazing book concerning animals' social strategies, including strategies of sexual conflict. Very, very interesting book. But it's nothing to do with social evolution models like from the 19th century or social Darwinism. Got to be very careful about that. David Wengrows wrote a poem recently and sent it around saying, all of you think you don't believe in social evolution, but really you do. And there's some cross wires going on there, really, because I do believe in social evolution. All animals, I mean, even trees are social. Well, I'm not sure we put it like that. Sorry, that's Robert. Are there more questions?
We're getting a little bit into that.
Yeah, we're nearly, if there's just a question or two left, we could take them. Otherwise, perhaps we're going to wind this up.
Is there a question that can have a really short answer? That'd be good.
Matthew Doyle, Matthew Doyle, can we unmute?
Yes, sorry, this maybe isn't a question that is going to have a short answer, but I just wanted some clarification really on the disagreement that maybe sort of Chris and Camilla and other people have with David Graeber on this sort of idea of social evolutionism, because I understand that article that you were talking about was sort of disputing this sort of narrative, which is the sort of Marxist version of social evolutionism, that the earliest stage of human society is primitive communism. So human beings live in a sort of egalitarian way. There are no hierarchies, but the sort of Marxist version of social evolutionism is this idea that with the emergence of settled societies, agrarian societies, and state societies, you have the emergence of hierarchy. And so it's a sort of inevitable progression. And then the sort of Marxist idea is that when the means of producing wealth in society reach a certain point, that allows for the possibility that you can have non-hierarchical social relations at the same time as you have material abundance. And so that's sort of true communism. And my understanding is that you at the Radical Anthropology group do sort of believe this kind of narrative in some way. And then this is the disagreement that you have with David Graeber, but maybe I've not understood. So just sort of seeking clarification on that.
Who's going to answer? Out of the three of us.
Well, I can have a go and you can add to it. Thanks for the clarification, Matthew. I think there were crossed wires in the debate that we had, because a great deal of their discussion of the Upper Paleolithic and the fact that there wasn't necessarily a radical transition between hunters and gatherers and farmers, we could agree with a lot of that. But you're right that we do view our origins as human nature as being revolutionary and communistic. And we do appeal, we don't like calling it primitive communism because of the problem with that, or communism, but original communism. And I prefer with hunter-gatherers to say anarcho-communism anyway, because it's not just simple communism, it's very complex. So we are emphasizing, just as I did a minute ago, that our ancestors in Africa, the ancestors that then sent populations all around the world, had the sort of stable egalitarianism that we can still see even now amongst African hunter-gatherers. So that it did provide that sort of launchpad platform for us to go around the world. Yeah, I mean, yes, we do that, but David and David have really had a go at the whole idea of African hunter-gatherers being egalitarian. They kind of have, but not in a way that's been published. It's like we've had these arguments, and yeah. So maybe it's going to get published in the new book.
I mean, just to say, can I just, and then Jerome, just what they say is that hunter-gatherers are no more likely to be egalitarian or communist than farmers, city dwellers, or anyone else. And I think what that leaves unexplained is how it is that we are, in Dave's terms, and I love this, communist by nature. So if it's kind of instinctive for humans to be communist and sharing, we do need to explain that. And it'd be very hard to explain it unless we say there was a period of evolution when Homo sapiens first emerged, when this, to each according to his ability, to each according to their needs, was the dominant logic of society. Because otherwise, how do we explain that our nature is so radically different from the nature, the instincts, if you like, of, say, for example, chimpanzees? So there must have been some turning of the world upside down. And there's a lot of literature about it, which neither of the Graebers, of the two Davids, are interested in. Christopher Boehm's written wonderful stuff about how dominance became replaced by what he calls reverse dominance. So that, if you like, the bottom-up coalition becomes more and more all-inclusive, more and more powerful, and eventually, if there is any dominance, if you want to call it that, it's the dominance of the bottom-up coalition against potential alpha males or selfishness. So we think that's a very good model, and I just don't understand really why either of the Davids see it as a good idea to knock it and to say that farming, for example, putting up fences and stuff, is just as likely to lead to egalitarianism and communism as an immediate return hunter-gathering, which was clearly the kind of social life which actually drove our emergence as a species and shaped our instincts. Jerome.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the problem is to do with the timescale in which these events occurred. You know, when we speak as we are tonight, we're compressing literally millions of years, or a couple of millions of years, or at least 1.5 million years of hominin history into this sort of, you know, pancake of rapid fire discussion. And of course, these things don't all happen in some immediate and totalizing way. So, I mean, from my point of view, you know, what Camilla and Chris have just been talking about, cooperative eyes, how did we get to achieve the level of encephalization, big brains that we have? You know, it's not a story that you can explain in the last 350,000 years or even 500,000 years. It's a story which began much before then. And if we want to really answer those questions, it's not really to just sort of say, oh, you know, there was this egalitarian childhood of man, and then, you know, off went everything else we know. These are you know, accrued developments, one on top of the other, which occurred over huge time spans. And I think that personally, it's probably somewhere Homo erectus are probably the heroes of this story. And because of course we can't talk to Homo erectus anymore, we just guess from the few bones and things that we find. But clearly, you know, something really radical happened to Homo erectus to enable, you know, people like the Heidelbergensis to emerge. These extraordinary aesthetes who napped these triangular hand axes with such extraordinary skill that no hominin lineage since has ever come close to that kind of level of beauty in terms of flint napping or stone napping. And so it really is a story which, if you compress in the way that I think David and David are doing in this book, it's easy to make the kinds of claims they have, but it just ignores that, you know, Paleolithic Europe was really not the world of, you know, where Homo sapiens became who they were. This is something that happened even before Homo sapiens existed. And Homo sapiens have just capitalized on the extraordinary achievements of Erectus and Heidelbergensis. And now, you know, have gone into this other. We are fundamentally primates. So of course we're politically sophisticated, just as gorillas and chimpanzees are. There's no question in my mind that there are and the evidence is absolutely clear. There are numerous ways of organizing yourself as a hunter-gatherer. But the key point that at the Radical Anthropology group we're trying to make is that all those various ways of organizing ourselves that Homo sapiens have demonstrated fundamentally depended on some point in the past when the hierarchies that are characteristic of our nearest primate relatives were overthrown, were overcome, where it was no longer acceptable for a single dominant male to impregnate all the females in his harem and get away with it. And that, I think, is what is distinctive in the different views that we hold. David and David seem to be describing something which is relatively recent in that story, something which has occurred over the past 30 to 50,000 years. Whereas what we're trying to do here is really think about that whole human story without being Homo sapiens exceptionalists, perhaps might be the word to use, and to really take account of the extraordinary achievements of all our ancestors in creating the possibilities that we now recognize as characteristic of our species.
Great. Perhaps that's a good note to end on.
I think we have to end, yes.
Yeah, we've got a few people running away by this stage, but I'd like to thank everybody for listening to and participating in the discussion, to thank Chris and Jerome, especially when he's so overworked, for joining us tonight. I think, yeah, I mean, it's the least we could do for our friend and comrade David. It's still very difficult to believe that he isn't here with us today.
Brilliant. We've got lots of lovely comments on it all, so thanks everybody.
Thank you very much.
Radical Anthropology on Vimeo will probably have a recording of all this up there before too long if I get around to it.
Yeah, we'll get it up there.
Yeah. And next week, don't forget, it's the survival of the friendliest. So is the world's
we'll
number
have
one.
some arguments with Brian Hare as well.
The world's number one.
If you want to know about the dogs and bonobos, he's the man.
Yep.
He sure is.
See you next week.
Bye.